Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Yom Hazikaron event. Actually, I should give it its full name, which of course is Yom Hazikaron Chalalei Marachot Yisrael V'Nifkei Pa'ulot Ha'eva. It's the name of Yom Hazikaron given by the State of Israel is Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers of the wars of Israel and for victims of terror. And this year, we are already honored to be able to host Arnold Roth, Mr. Arnold Roth, for our Yom HaZikaron commemoration. Other years, we focused on different aspects of Yom HaZikaron, but I think this year it makes sense for us to perhaps think about and hear and understand a little bit about a different aspect of what Yom HaZikaron is really set aside as an official remembrance day for. And therefore, I really want to thank you, Mr. Roth, for joining us this evening. Well, this evening here where we are. Arnold Roth and his wife Frimet are native New Yorkers. Sorry, I should correct that. Mr. Roth is a Melbourne-born and Frimet is a native New Yorker. And they live in Jerusalem, where they, with their children, settled in 1988. And their daughter Malki was murdered at the age of 15 in the 2001 bombing of the Sbarro pizzeria, which was a terrorist outrage masterminded on behalf of Hamas by a Jordanian woman, Ahlam Tamimi. And for this Yom HaZikaron, we felt it was important to hear Mr. Roth's story, to hear experiences, and also some of the events subsequent to that terrible and dark day in 2001 when Malki lost her life, was murdered brutally. Before I go further, though, I do want to thank Julie Conn from our Education Committee, who has made this evening possible, along with Mrs. Aviva Rowe, who has joined us here this evening, who introduced us as a community, introduced me to Arnold Roth, and has enabled this evening to take place. The format of the evening will be that Mr. Roth will speak for some 40 minutes, and after that there will be time for us to ask questions. I'll follow the normal format of muting everyone, but when we get to the question time, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions directly, or if you prefer to post questions on the chat, you can PM them directly to me or post them on the general chat, and I'll try and moderate them and pass them on to our guest speaker. At the conclusion of the evening, we will be lighting a candle, Le'ilin Nishmas, all the victims of terror and soldiers who have fallen in battle, and particularly for your daughter, Mr. Roth, Malki, Malka Chana Roth, following which we will say a communal Kel Moni Rachmim and a Perikot Tehillim and sing Achenu. So that's going to be the format for this evening, and the aim is for us to finish on time at 9 o'clock our time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Mr. Roth, to Arnold, and ask you to, you should be able to unmute yourself. I'll allow you to unmute yourself, and I'm going to highlight your screen.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Zobin, and thank you very much, Mrs. Rowe, for being instrumental in making this shidduch. I'm in the, I want to use the word unenviable role of building a bridge. There's something quite intimate and intensely personal about speaking on themes of grief and bereavement and loss and anger and revenge and vengeance and justice. These are all, every one of them, powerful words that are only just words, but all of us know that those words are proxies for something much deeper. And I make those points at the beginning because this being Yom HaZikaron, even in the UK, right? You're after sunset now, right? Or not quite. We've already had the sirens, and we've already started the official tkasim, the ceremonies, and the mood is heavy. There's just no getting away from it. You don't hear kids playing in the street. You don't hear music, even the music that blares out of the cars of some of the local yahoos here. It's quiet. It's a subdued atmosphere. It's akin to Yom Kippur, which is also a subdued atmosphere, at least here in Yerushalayim. And it's subdued for a reason. There's almost no family that's untouched by the stock in trade of Yom Hazikaron, the issues that everybody talks about, the loss, the pain, the frustration, very often the anger as well. And simply living in the midst of all of this accustoms people to being very cautious. You never know who's standing next to you when you're at the ATM. I was going to say Kaspamet, at the ATM, or at the supermarket checkout. You don't know what sort of lives are walking around you, and this is nowhere more clear than on Yom HaZikaron, where the heavy burden of pain and of bereavement and of loss has fallen unequally, without any real logic, none that we can see. There's a great accountant in heaven who keeps the books. We don't really understand, and we can't really expect to understand the logic of it. But what it means is that all of us, those of us who feel like speaking in terms of lightness and even humor on a day like this, others who want to bring doom and gloom and depression and oppression and really serious unhappiness into the room if someone asks them to speak. Everybody has got this burden on them of not really knowing who they're talking to, not really knowing what people are carrying around in their chests or in their hearts or in their minds. And to make all of this work requires the utmost of tolerance and restraint and understanding. Having said all of those, I would permit myself to say high-sounding words. I nonetheless intend to drill right down into what brings me in front of audiences as a speaker. Some of it is probably going to induce squirming, and some of it will probably sound perhaps even rote or cliched to those of you who've sat through a Yom HaZikaron talk in the past. In any event, my story has to do with the fact that my daughter Malki, Malka Chana, who was perhaps the sweetest and most optimistic person I ever met in my life, was murdered without our getting any idea ahead of time that it was going to happen on a hot summer's day on the 9th of August 2001. The reason that I'm still speaking to people this many years later, it's going to be 20 years at the next anniversary, which will fall just before 9/11. And in fact, 9/11 is part of the story. The reason that I'm still trotted out is that it hasn't all ended for us, because the murderer is not only free, but famous, being protected by a country with which every government that I know, every government that I respect, has extremely friendly terms. And that government, which is the government of the Kingdom of the Hashemites in Jordan, is continuing until this very hour, 10:10 on a whatever night of the week this is, 13th of April, to protect her, to give her the life of a celebrity, and to enable her to be toxic, influential, inciting additional terror, a lightning rod for bigotry, and for some of the most murderous views that I've ever encountered. And I wouldn't be surprised if you felt the same way after I explain them. There are two public dimensions to my life. That's one of them. I'm going to talk about the loss and the painful and turbulent pursuit of justice that my wife and I are engaged in. And I'm also going to talk about something a lot more uplifting, which is the thing that we do to force people to remember Malki, but in a very positive way. Speaking face to face, as I'm doing now, is one of the few ways my wife and I have of informing people of the distressing things to which we're exposed as we keep pursuing justice. A Jordanian woman whose name is Ahlam Tamimi is today the most wanted female fugitive alive. The most wanted female fugitive alive. Officially designated as an FBI most wanted terrorist, one of only 2 females on that exclusive list. But it's more than just her being free that's at the core of our efforts. It's that her freedom has been achieved with the full participation of the Jordanian royal leadership and with, to a considerable extent, the acquiescence, not so active, more passive, but nonetheless acquiescence of governments a lot closer to home and a lot less subject to the kind of criticisms that you're going to hear me make in the next 50, 40 minutes or so. Some of what I have to do here today is briefly share the sequence of events. I wish I didn't have to. It would be much easier for me if I could just say, well, you all know what happened to my daughter, and then how the murderer became a celebrity and is still free, and all of these efforts that we've made have been useless, and then focus only on the events of the last 3 or 4 months. That's what I'd like to do. But since most people don't know because the media won't tell them, I need to just spend a few minutes retailing and giving over to you the basics. My wife and I have 7 children. We came to Israel in August 1988 from Melbourne after I dragged Frimet, a New Yorker, to Melbourne after she asked me on our very first date, well, what is your plan for Aliyah? And I obviously had the right answer because we've been married since 1976, and we have children and grandchildren, thank God, who are growing up here as Israelis in the city of Jerusalem where we live. Of the 7 children, 6 are alive today, all except for our youngest, who is profoundly brain damaged, blind, incapable of doing anything for herself, in need of care 24 hours a day. All of our other children are married and with their own children. And I have to say that we're a relatively tight-knit family. And apart from global pandemics, which have somewhat affected our routine, we enjoy being in each other's company very much. Or as I like to say, we don't just love each other, we also like each other. Malki was born in Melbourne 2.5 years before we made Aliyah. Her coming into the family was preceded by 3 boys, and her arrival was followed by 3 girls, all born here in Yerushalayim. So Malki always saw herself as what she called the meat in the sandwich. From an early age, she had a very special way of understanding and enjoying people, of sensing when there was a need to reach out and help. I'm saying a lot. I think she was one of the most empathetic people I've ever known. On the 9th of August 2001, she was 15 and a half years old and on school holidays. Her best friend was the girl who lived next door, Michal Raziel, whose mother was raised in the United Kingdom. The 2 girls built for themselves a day that consisted of 3 parts. The first part was to go across to the other side of our neighborhood where we lived at that time, on the north side of Jerusalem, and to decorate the bedroom of a girlfriend who was coming back that day from the United States. It was the summer vacation, summer holidays. Then to take a break in the center of town and go and get something to eat, and then go off to a meeting of the Ezra youth group, in which both of the girls were madrichot, youth leaders, and to participate in a meeting for the planning of the annual summer camp, which was going to take place the week after. The girls were standing at the counter of the Sbarro pizzeria when a man wearing what looked like Israeli clothing and looking looking usual, not unusual at all, but carrying a guitar case on his back, walked up, stood next to them, and destroyed everybody and everything in the pizzeria. He'd been brought there by a woman, the woman I mentioned a few minutes ago, Ahlam Tamimi, who was 21 years old, who was a student of journalism and who was the newsreader on a TV station. And in fact, as soon as the delivery of the bomb was made to the door of the Sbarro pizzeria on the corner of King George and Yafo, she fled, but that was the arrangement, and was already on a bus heading back to Ramallah when everything ended for us, when the explosion created a whole new world for Jerusalem and in a certain sense for all of Israel and the Jewish people. The woman returned to Ramallah. She has described in graphic terms what it was like being on the bus, or the small bus, the Monit Sherut, a sort of a shared taxi, on her way back to Ramallah. Everybody was jubilant. The reports were coming in over the radio of deaths. At first, there were only 3 deaths, and she says, I was disappointed. She has said it on TV, and it's been shown everywhere. Then there were 5, and then there were 8. And then by the time they got to Ramallah, the police stopped them in order to cheer with them, and everybody was jubilant. We're talking of a world that none of us would recognize, a world where the values are upside down. She went on TV when the news program was on, when she read the headlines. I've got the recording of it, and she doesn't give any indication on her face of what was going on inside her, but she has said it since then. She has said, I was so proud. I was so happy. God wanted me to succeed, and I succeeded, and nobody knew. I wanted to tell them, but I couldn't tell them. She was arrested just a short time later, a few weeks. She was brought to trial. Eventually, she was tried. She confessed to all of the charges. She enraged the judges by sitting there and smiling the entire time. She made a speech to the judges. I won't waste any time recreating the sense of what she said. And she was sentenced to 16 terms of life imprisonment. From our point of view, and I'm being very superficial here, because if I spent time dwelling on what this did to us and the changes that are brought about in our outlook on life, our outlook on each other, the pressures on the marriage, the pressures on the relationship between parents and children, then it would be a replay of other speeches that you could hear from really anybody who has gone through the awful experience of losing somebody to an act of violence, whether it's to a soldier or to some innocent person who was murdered by terrorists. Instead, I really want to move past this stage and make the assumption that you know what I'm talking about, that you know how utterly dark was the space that we were in, how beyond questions we were. We had no answers. We barely had the questions. We didn't know what to think. And I'll just mention in passing at this stage something that perhaps you might want to know about that I'm not going to be able to tell you very much. What does something like this do to somebody who believes in the hand of the Ribono Shel Olam running the world, and someone who believes that we have things that we're obliged to do in life, that if we do them are compatible with our receiving blessings, and avoids doing things that we're raised as children to understand that if you're not complying with what heaven's decree is and the commandments that have been given to the Jewish people, then don't expect the same kinds of blessings. All of that gets turned on its head in many, many, many situations. I'm the child of parents who arrived in Australia, as almost all the parents of the children that I grew up with in Melbourne, Australia, the most Holocaust-affected Jewish community in the world. And everyone that I knew, everyone that I grew up with had no grandparents and had parents who themselves had lost everything. And my own parents are a pretty good example. Rasha v'tov lo, tzadik v'ra lo. We don't have any doctrinal problems in recognizing that there are big questions here, big questions, and I don't have the answers. And fortunately, there aren't that many good answers. And for the most part, one of the most difficult things that I ever have to confront is people who approach me saying, let me explain it to you. I'm not open to the explanations of people who don't know me, and therefore I'm moving right past that stage. So what happened after the woman was sentenced to 16 terms of life imprisonment? And the answer is, well, not that much. We, at some part of our consciousness, and when I say we, I'm always talking about my wife and me, we recognize that she was in prison and was never going to get out. And the obligation on us was to try to make sense of this by raising wonderful children and having a wonderful parental experience and being good neighbors and contributing to society. And we made a decision to establish a charitable foundation and to be focused on our own world, the things where we felt that we could influence what was going on in our own lives, and to leave the grand plan of justice and punishment to smarter heads and to the hand of the, as I mentioned, of the Ribono Shel Olam. But starting only a couple of years after that savage was put behind bars, she was already being interviewed in the Israeli prison by journalists from Israel, from the United States, and from Europe. And it wasn't long, I think about 2 years after she was sentenced, that she appeared on the front page of the art section of the New York Times. Now, I don't know if the New York Times is a newspaper that you've heard of in the United Kingdom, but it's phenomenally influential. And if you're on the front page of a section of the New York Times, people are very interested in you. What in heaven's name is a woman doing, smiling out of the front page of the art section of the New York Times, who only has one thing for which she's famous, and that's the slaughter of children. She set out to kill children. She says so. She wanted them to be Jewish children. She did it. She was caught and then said, yes, I did it. She was sentenced and she said, I'm going to get out of here. She said it to the judges. I'm going to get out of here. And when I do, I'm going to be smiling the same smile that I'm smiling at you right now. Why is she on the front page of the New York Times? What brings the authorities to allow journalists to come in? And what brings the journalists to even want to spin a tale, to create a frame of reference for a woman like this that is all about how happy she is and how proud she is of what she's done? Well, problems like that kept coming up again and again. And then we had the terrible affair of the Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, two of whose colleagues were killed at the time that he was captured, and who was then held hostage for more than 5 years by Hamas. No sign of where he was being kept ever emerged. While the hunt for Gilad Shalit was going on, Israeli society went through a transformation of, first of all, lining ourselves up behind the desire that everything should be done to free Gilad Shalit by whatever means, preferably violent, so that there'd be no real price to pay other than the price of violence. But eventually, 90% of us, I'm being a little coy about this. I was never part of this majority, not at any stage. I am totally opposed to the idea of doing transactions in which terrorists are handed over, but I'm getting ahead of myself. 90% of Israelis, by the time we got to October 2011, were in favor of doing, quote unquote, anything and everything, which was the expression that was being used, to release Gilad Shalit. And when the Hamas people stated their terms, and their terms were all the women in the Israeli prison system, Arab women, terrorists is the word. I'm not going to try to soften the language. Terrorists, all the women come out, and we want a large number of men. And in the end, the price was 1,027. The announcement was made on Erev Sukkot of October of 2011. It was a terrible shock for us. We'd been anticipating it, but it was a shock when it arrived. And she was on the list. This woman, this hideous woman, for whom the judges troubled themselves, the 3 judges in the Israeli system, to say, we hereby put on the record that we strongly urge the government of Israel never to consider giving this woman parole or including her in any future political deal. That was what is called a bracha levatala. It was a total waste of time. So that on the 18th of October, 2011, sitting in our own home, miserable, angry, confused, we watched as the country rejoiced in receiving Gilad Shalit home, but pretty much turned away as 1,027 terrorists, more than half of whom, and please don't tell me you've heard this, because I don't believe anybody has heard this. I think I'm the only person who's ever done the calculations. More than half of whom were murderers. If this had been said in the appropriate way to the Israeli public, I don't think there would have been 90% support for the deal. There are serious issues in why we do a deal like this. I'm not trying to simplify them. I'm trying to simply convey to you that that's where we were in October 2011, massive support for the idea of doing a deal with Hamas and ignoring what was going to happen next for a certainty, which was that innocent Israelis were going to be murdered by the people who walked out. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. But our case is not quite that case. The woman walked out, was put on a bus along with most of the other prisoners to go to Cairo. And in Cairo, she and one other woman were singled out for a special encounter with Khalid Mashal, who was then and still is a prominent leader in Hamas. And she was then put on a flight as a VIP passenger to Jordan, which is where she was born, where she had lived until just a year or two before the massacre, and where she is now living. Her family is Jordanian. She was born in Jordan, and that's where she went. She was received as a conquering hero. And from there, it just went downhill, step after step after step. In February 2012, we're now talking roughly 7 or 8 weeks after her return to Jordan, a period during which she was in the news every day, giving speeches, being celebrated, being honored as if she had won the Nobel Prize. But of course, she had simply murdered Israeli children and gotten away with it. She was advertised as starting her own TV show, her own TV show. I heard about this. By that time, I had picked up the practice, which continues to be my practice until today. I start the day before I daven even, going into the Arab media on the internet and reading whatever there is that touches on her. I don't speak Arabic, but my uncle Google does, and he helps me translate these articles as often and as intensively as I want. I was so outraged, and after speaking with my wife, decided that we had to do something by some measure, which wasn't even clear in our minds, bring her to justice. And that's when I learned about an American law. I've already mentioned that Frimet comes from the United States. All of our children have American citizenship. I don't, but my children do. They're also, of course, all Israelis. I discovered that there's a law which says that if Americans are the victims of an act of terrorism outside the territorial United States, and where there is a weapon of mass destruction involved, the perpetrators will become the subjects or the objects of a worldwide pursuit by the American legal authorities, with the intent that they be arrested and brought to trial in America under American law. A terrific law that nobody I spoke to had ever heard of. I made a terrific arrangement with a terrific lawyer who has been part of our story from that time right up until this evening. He and I went to the Department of Justice in Washington together. We spent several hours there with a large group of senior officials from the DOJ and from the FBI. And in the course of speaking to them, I explained that this law had never been applied even once in any of the important cases in which American citizens had been murdered in Israel by Palestinian Arab terrorists. Here is a law that's been on the book for years and it's never once been applied because this was Israel. I need you to commit that you're going to do it. I need you to now make a change. That's what I said. By the time my colleague and I left, we had an assurance from the senior officials there that they were going to do whatever they could do and that they would let us know as soon as they could tell us everything. But until they could tell us everything, they would tell us anything. They wouldn't tell us anything. And I came back to Jerusalem and told my wife that we were in for a tough few weeks, maybe some months, because they weren't going to tell us anything until they had this woman in handcuffs and leg chains and in front of a judge. But in fact, it was more than 5 years of total silence until March 2017. And at that point, we learned, the details aren't that important, we learned that 3 hours after a meeting that was here in Jerusalem by a group of American officials from the DOJ, the Department of Justice, an announcement was going to be made that, in fact, charges had been brought against this woman 4 years earlier and had been kept under seal. And my understanding, but nobody's actually said this explicitly, is that the reason for those 4 years is that the United States was trying to persuade Jordan to hand the woman over under the extradition treaty. Let me just spend a moment explaining what that means. Extradition, as people know, means one country asks another country to do something that, if it weren't for the contract between them, which we call a treaty, that other country wouldn't have to do it. But once there is a treaty, the treaty is usually signed for good reasons and for benefits to both sides. The request to hand the person over, provided that the conditions are satisfied, is met with what flight and what time. Those are the only questions that follow. What flight and what time? Not with Jordan. So that by the time we even knew that there were charges, Jordan and the United States were already at a standoff, and no one knew about it. Well, the announcement went ahead that day. It was said that the woman was being added to the FBI most wanted terrorists list, and she was. I'd never heard of it. And that there was an arrest warrant, and that there was a request to have her extradited. And that was pretty much it. We went home, and by the time we got home and we'd been talking to each other in the car, I had more questions. And eventually I got back in contact with the people from the Department of Justice and asked, first of all, what about a reward? I see that everybody on this wonderful FBI most wanted terrorists list has a reward on their heads. She doesn't. And I was told something very strange. We didn't forget we didn't overlook, and it's not for lack of trying. And that was my introduction to the way in which the United States is incoherent in the way in which it has pursued this woman. Incoherent in the sense that I'm convinced that the justice professionals, the justice system wants to see her brought to trial in the United States, and that other parts of the government are more concerned with the political fallout involving a precious relationship with our friends in Jordan, who evidently are not that interested in seeing this woman handed over. So you might want to say, well, that's reasonable. The Jordanians never hand anybody over to the United States, but you'd be wrong. The United States has asked for Jordanian fugitive terrorists multiple times, and Jordan has handed them over multiple times. And several of those people are in prison and will stay there in the United States for the rest of their lives. Something about Tamimi. Let's think about this for a second. Something about this woman, her case, it's different. Oh, could it be that she murdered Jewish children? She says it. I went there to murder Jewish children, and she is now free. And that makes her somebody whom the Jordanian government can't hand over. I'm going to leave those comments because otherwise I'm really going to run out of time here. In the years since March 2017 and the announcement by the American authorities that they were indeed unsealing charges against her and wanted to bring her to trial, there have been some really serious bumps in the road. The first came 6 days later. 6 days after that announcement, the Jordanian highest court, it's called the Court of Cassation, handed down a ruling that, as I understand it, was unexpected by the American authorities, which said the treaty from 1995, the extradition treaty, the one signed by King Hussein and Bill Clinton, with all of those formal documents, that treaty was invalid from the day that it was signed and is invalid today and is not a basis for our handing this woman over. Hang up the phone. Well, they didn't hang up the phone. They were handing down a judgment. The highest court in Jordan made that statement. I'm here to tell you that almost every word of their statement is misleading, disingenuous, or outright made up. But I haven't seen a single journalist who has taken the trouble, not one, to look into what the Jordanians did that day, which was on the 20th or 21st of October 2017. And in fact, the only people who are claiming out loud that the argument of the Jordanians that they don't have to hand her over is one of them is sitting in front of you and the other one is my wife in the next room. This is absurd. What happened after that is a series of efforts on our part to get the United States to speak more clearly about what the real situation is between the United States and Jordan. And then at a later stage, it was, well, where does the Jewish community stand? Are they with us or are they against us? And then most recently, just a few weeks ago, and I'm skipping a lot of steps, the International Law Enforcement Communications Network, which is called Interpol, made what is in some ways quite a bizarre statement in announcing at the beginning of March that Ahlam Tamimi has been removed from their red notice alert system, such that if she travels to another country, in other words, leaves Jordan where she's been, has not left Jordan since September 2016. There's a lot of detail here and I'm skipping the explanations. If she does that now, no one will bother her. That is, Interpol will not notify the government of Tanganyika if she turns up at Tanganyika's front door that this is a woman for whom there's an arrest order in the United States. That was unwelcome. We're not entirely clear as to what might have brought this about, but it's a reality. Jordan has gone through turmoil in the last 8 or 9 or 10 days. As I'm guessing most of you are aware, the king is under a certain degree of criticism and pressure from, in the first place, his half-brother, Prince Hamza, and in a larger sense from critics of his rule. But every country, as far as I know on earth, has lined up to tell the king and his kingdom how staunchly behind him they are. And for us, this is terribly depressing because what we think every kingdom and government and democracy and a tyrannical regime in the world ought to be saying, but why are you holding on to this woman who murdered all of those Jewish children? But of course, that isn't what's happening. the pursuit of justice is something that I dreamed about from when I was a child. Sorry, did I really say that? The pursuit of justice is something that I never in my wildest nightmares ever imagined that I would have to do because of the murder of my daughter. I cannot tell you how far away from that reality I am, even now, having lived it for almost 20 years. But here I am, together with my wife, writing articles, op-eds, trying to get in front of synagogues and churches and every other kind of group that you can imagine. I've gone in front of the US Congress. I've made speeches on as whatever TV or radio or news networks would be willing to hear me explain the preposterous nature of what this is all about. The woman says she did it. The people around her think she's a hero because she did it. She faces charges in the United States, which is by far Jordan's most important patron. Jordan is the third largest recipient in the world of American foreign aid. And to make this absurdity even clearer, and I'm going to wrap this up in the next 2 minutes, the United States Congress has now legislated twice, this past December and the one before, to impose sanctions on any country which, now let's follow this, has a treaty with the United States, fails to comply with the treaty, receives foreign aid from the United States. If those conditions are fulfilled, the foreign aid stops. Has it stopped? No, it hasn't stopped. So where does that leave us? Well, my wife and I urge people to give us their support. My wife and I write a lot in order to get people angry and upset. And do you know what makes our job almost impossible? The fact that there is no part of the media which has gotten behind this story, no part of the mainstream media. Yes, there are certain papers and certain websites and so on, but the important movers of political opinion, the people who move the needle, the newspapers, you have some of them in the UK, The Guardian, The Times, The Scotsman. In the United States, there are far more. And this is really all about the United States because it's American law that she is pursued by. They won't touch the story. Now, in the last 30 seconds that I have imposed on myself, because I've agreed with the rabbi that we're going to open this up to questions and comments, in the United States, there is a groundswell of support for what we're asking the authorities to do, but not a single voice in 3 consecutive administrations, the Obama, the Trump, and now the Biden, of senior political officials who've gotten up and said, this case of the woman who blew up the pizzeria, we can't allow that to pass. That's the situation that we're in, trying to have the United States Department of Justice, the most important law firm in the world by far, do what it has set out for itself to do, while the State Department, certainly one of the most important foreign offices in the world, appears to continue to want to not have that happen because of some supervening relationship with the Jordanians. And what do the Jordanians want? The Jordanians want to be left alone. The Jordanian government doesn't want to have this issue raised, and a procession of senior Jordanian officials, and I won't, out of politeness, tell you how senior, have been confronted by the occasional question on this matter and said, oh, I've never heard of that. Why don't you send me a memo and I will have my staff look into it? So I'm coming to the end of what is an abbreviated version of a complicated story, but the essence of it is very straightforward and is completely consistent with the day that we are now in the middle of honoring, Yom Hazikaron. Yom Hazikaron, not only for the soldiers, but also for victims of terror. But there are situations, and my own case is an outstanding example of that, where the terror and the bereavement and grief and loss and horror of losing a child, and I don't intend to go into the words and what they really mean. The horror of losing a child is something that is beyond words. But this is worse. This goes beyond that. Knowing that this woman, this unspeakable barbaric savage, is not only free, but is honored for being free, while the rest of the world, did someone say something? Looks away. That's almost unbearably grinding to the soul. That's exactly where we are. We need people to support us. You don't have to be an American. We have a website called This Ongoing War, one word, thisongoingwar.blogspot.com, which is where we write most of the things that we want people to know. But now I come to the one bright spot in all of this, and I must spend a couple of moments telling you that in Malki's memory, we created the Malki Foundation. It's a real organization. It's serious. It's been going now on the 11th of September this year, which will be the 20th anniversary of the bringing down of the Twin Towers and the destruction of the Pentagon. On that day, the registration papers for the foundation in memory of my daughter came out. So it's going to be 20 years old in September. We do wonderful things. We have a youngest child who is blind and brain damaged. I mentioned her before, Chaya Elisheva. Malki adored her. Malki's example in caring for her own sister in ways that it would take me hours to simply recount them to you, was the example that we wanted to put at the heart of a charitable effort that would bring good into the world in Malki's name, which would enable us to look in the mirror and to say to ourselves, two sides of the same coin? No, we're very different. We have a set of values that are unrecognizable, absolutely polar opposites of the values that we see in all of the people that I've mentioned over these last few minutes. We're sustained by the good that's done by the Malki Foundation. We have an office in London where we try to create awareness and raise funds and support. I only want to urge people to go to www.karenmalki, Karen is of course foundation, karenmalki, malki.org, and read and listen. Malki wrote a wonderful song. That song is on the website. It's been recorded many times now by various artists. Everything about Malki's memory is uplifting and a blessing to us, and I would say in a larger sense to the Jewish people and to humanity. But there is a failure. There's a failure of significant dimensions in which it's necessary for me to get up in front of a group of people, almost none of whom I've ever met before, and say, please give us your support. Please sign our petition. It's on the front page of the thisongoingwar.blogspot.com site that I mentioned a moment ago. Sign the petition. The petition addresses the Secretary of State of the United States and says, for heaven's sake, put the heavy word on Jordan. They need you much more than you need them. And what they're doing is outrageous. Those aren't the words that you'll find in the petition, but that's the sense of it. At this point, thank you very much for your attention. I invite comments and of course questions. And I just urge you to please don't forget Malki and please help us to achieve justice in this important cause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those heartfelt words, and for sharing with us a little bit of the pain, the agony, the confusion, the strength, and your struggle for justice. Above all, I'm going to open the floor to questions. Please, people can feel free to either post a question privately to me on the chat, and I'll try and pass it on, or to ask questions directly. But perhaps I'll use the power of the chair to ask a first question myself, and there are actually already questions now coming through on the chat also, so please do feel free to post questions. You spoke about you spoke openly about the questions that confronted you, your wife, your family after Malki's tragic murder, the challenges to family, to relationships, the avoidance of pat and simplistic answers. But what did give you the strength then to be able to do what you've done since, to be able to speak to us, and perhaps above all to set up the Malki Foundation and do so much good? Where did you and your wife and your family draw that strength from?
The answer is in two parts. I'll state the part first that has the less universal appeal to it. As the child of parents who lost everything, and as somebody who lived in a community where no one had any photographs of grandparents because they ended the war in pajamas and starving and bereft of everything, I learned that there are phenomenal, there's a phenomenal amount of pain in the world and phenomenal resources to simply get on with life and move ahead. My parents were, though I didn't understand it myself as a child, outstanding examples, along with all of their friends, the people who would come to our homes every Motzei Shabbos, every Sunday night, when my parents had a thriving social life all the years, and just spend time with each other, talking and chatting and eating and enjoying life. An enormous amount of resilience, an enormous passion to, first of all, get married immediately in those 2 or 3 years right after the war. Everybody that I knew was the result of a marriage that was made in 1946 or 47 or 48. And then they all looked to get as far away from Germany as they could. So resilience and having to focus on family and on good things and not get drawn into how bad things are. That it's all trite. It requires a lot of explanation because I'm being very superficial and generalizing things, but at the heart, what I've just said is really what was going through my mind as I was trying to make sense of the situation I was in. And I still had my mother at that stage to talk to, and she was heartbroken. She was very close with Malki. Speaking with my mother, my father had died much earlier, was very, very helpful. That's one aspect. The second aspect is much more universal. I'm not somebody who was actively involved in charity. I was certainly actively involved in Jewish affairs. I was the president of the Australian Union of Jewish Students. I sat on the I was vice president of the World Jewish Congress, World Union of Jewish Students, and on the board of the World Jewish Congress. These were important things to me until they stopped being important to me. Basically, when I started making a family with my wife, what was always outside of my experience was, first of all, tzedakah, raising money so that money could be used for the benefit of other people, but much more to the point, chesed. And what I learned about chesed, what is inadequately translated as acts of loving kindness, because most people don't really know what loving kindness is, was taught to me by Malki. Malki used to carry her little sister into her own bed almost every night. She never had a conversation with her little sister Chaya, because Chaya has never spoken a word, and she's blind, and she has seizures at a tremendous frequency. Most people, even our grandchildren, are cautious about even approaching our daughter, who lives with us, as I said. Malki was absolutely, totally embraced the challenge of doing whatever she could to help her little sister, and then to help other people, her friends at school, and then later on, the kids who were in her charge when she was a madricha in Ezra, understand the sheer fun and beauty and deep satisfaction that comes with reaching out to people with special needs, especially children. Now, all of that sounds like a speech, but I haven't begun, because if that speech is like a 4-hour job. But the essence of it is that, Baruch Hashem, chesed saves lives. It certainly has saved mine. It saved my sanity, and I think in a practical sense, it saved my family. Being able to be doing things that whose intrinsic good is that it helps other people and it doesn't take away from you, but it also doesn't do anything specifically for you. You don't get a knighthood, you don't get a building named after you. You just get this deep satisfaction that somebody, and often it's people who you don't know, and sometimes they're members of the Arab community in Israel. A third of all of our beneficiaries in the Malki Foundation, and I'll say in a minute what we do, are Arabs. I'm not opposed to the Arabs. I don't have any problems with the Arabs, but I don't know that I ever saw myself building with all the hours that I have in the day as an honorary. I'm the honorary chairman of the organization. We have a full-time staff who do wonderful work, doing that for the benefit of a population 1/3 of which is Arabs. Again, don't misunderstand me. I don't have any problem with it, but it surprises me. The Malki Foundation does 2 things outstandingly, and we're quite unique in this. One is that we provide equipment that is available free of charge on a lending basis to families all over the country that enable a family to make the decision to keep their very disabled child at home. No solution has ever been invented for taking care and helping children with special needs reach their potential any better than having the child at home with loving parents. It doesn't always work. It's not always possible for the parents to do it, but there are lots of families who do it, who want to do it, and who are immensely frustrated by the failures of the Israeli welfare system. And that's a separate discussion as well. I'm not here to attack Israel. I'm a passionate Zionist. I've never for a moment doubted, nor has my wife, that we're in the right place, raising our children and our grandchildren in the right place, and that won't change. But the way in which Israel deals with its disabled is not the finest part of what makes Israel a wonderful society to live in. So that's the one thing, is helping people with equipment. And the other, which takes a little more explanation, which I'm not going to do now because we just don't have time, is we fund therapies, non-medical therapies, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, horse riding therapy, and water therapy. Only 5 therapies, but we've now funded something like 60,000 sessions, every last one of which was going to be refused by the health funds. In other words, Israel, with its highly centralized medical system, which Baruch Hashem has resulted in our essentially defeating the pandemic, that's the positive side, has a very negative side, which is that there's something really drastically wrong with the way it views the needs of families who are raising a special needs child. So our contribution here is to be, in effect, the safety net, the supplier of last resort for families who are being driven crazy by the inadequacies of the medical system. And Baruch Hashem, we never ask for letters of appreciation or support. We have them plastered all over the wall. They keep coming in. And I truly believe, since I'm not one of the people who works at it day to day, I'm the fundraiser and I'm the person who supervises the work of the executives, we're doing it efficiently, we're doing it effectively, and we're doing it in a way that everyone who pays attention to it, and especially Jewish people, would be proud of.
I don't know how to thank you for that answer, and that passionate sharing of the power of Chesed. It was just very, very powerful words. I grew up with a severely disabled and blind sister who my parents kept at home, and your words struck a very personal chord also, besides the general message that you shared. Someone has posted here a question, and I do want to ask it, and forgive me for asking it. They said, as we are a profoundly Zionist community, we all feel a very close connection to Israel. But they say, if they understood correctly, whilst Tamimi was in prison in Israel, she was allowed to be interviewed by journalists and given public access. How do you make sense of that? What are we meant to feel about that and think about it?
Look, I walk a tightrope. I will not criticize the state of Israel when I'm sitting in Jerusalem or being heard by people who are outside of Israel. So let me simply say that political machinations are equally ugly in Israel and pretty much everywhere else on earth. If issues are being resolved by people who have politics on their minds instead of doing the right thing, there will always be bad results. And this is an example. Beyond that, I choose to deflect the question and invite anybody who wants a serious answer to come here, sit down with me over a drink, and I'll gladly spill. There's a lot to be said.
I understand. Thank you. I'm going to stick actually to just two more questions that have come through, and then I want to hand over to Akel Mariachmim. One is actually a similar question as in the previous one, but this time talking about America. As a believer in democracy, liberal democracy, and American justice, and so on, how do you understand why there's been such stalling and resistance by the American authorities, by the Justice Department, by the State Department? What sense were you meant to make of that?
I'm going to slightly avoid the question in order to make another point that bears on the question. We've gotten some support in Congress. Strikingly, we've gotten almost no support from anybody on the Democratic Party side of the Congress. This is not because we're a partisan issue. We're clearly not a partisan issue, but that's how it is. The underlying issues are all politics, and as you may have already surmised, I'm not a big fan of politics or of politicians. But in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be making an announcement which stems from the fact that my wife and I sued the United States in December, and we've achieved a settlement which has some significant consequences, which we are choosing not to announce it, and not to announce until we've put some certain next steps into place. It's very significant, and it will change the way in which the media and the government view the Tamimi case. What is clear is that there's a certain, I would call it a con job. The government of Jordan has succeeded in doing something that, and I always credit my wife for this, she's borrowed a term that was very popular at the time of the American involvement in South Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, where the South Vietnamese government, which on any view was hopelessly corrupt by the time Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese government was the tail that wagged the dog. Through various means, the South Vietnamese, and by this I mean the Jordanians, persuaded the Americans that they were so important that the Americans couldn't afford to do what the Americans needed to do in America's own interests. So America kept making big mistakes until everything collapsed. Now, not everything is collapsing in Jordan, but we think that what's being done in Jordan by American forbearance of the Jordanian government and its people lining up behind this woman. There hasn't been a single word of criticism published in that country about the Jordanian adulation of this woman, about the way she had her own TV show for 5 years, how she had her own This Is Your Life program a couple of years ago on commercial television in Jordan. This is all wrong and sick and betokens some real malaise in the Jordanian, but it's not the Jordanians who interest us, it's the Americans. And there are big mistakes being made by the American government. I permit myself to say that because I've said it in public and I've written about it. How to fix that involves a number of steps. The one that I just want to mention, because it's in the title of my talk today, and I haven't spent enough time talking about it, is Jewish community leadership. There is, to a considerable extent, a failure of American Jewish leadership, not wall to wall, but big parts of it. There are Jewish American organizations that have either told us that they cannot support us without ever explaining why, and I know the reason why, because the relationship with Jordan is perceived to be so tremendously valuable, or have never acknowledged any correspondence. Now, I'm talking about some of the most important American Jewish organizations in the world. I haven't named any of them. I don't intend to name any of them until we see this woman behind bars, but it really is a university education in how leadership works. We have a lot of improvement to do, probably not only in the United States, but I'm only focused on the United States at the moment. And it indicates something seriously rotten in the way in which we organize ourselves as diaspora Jewish communities. And I'm not making the diaspora look worse than Israel, because I'm no fan of the Israeli political system. We're going into our 5th election, as you may have heard, even in England. And this is not a sign of a healthy democracy. It's a sign of something that is hopelessly in a stalemate.
Thank you for that answer, and I think we look forward to hearing the announcement in the next couple of weeks, and obviously wish you Hatzlacha Rabba in your campaign. I will just conclude my remarks by reminding all of us that Mr. Roth, as he said in his words, speaks to shuls, speaks to communities, speaks to synagogues for a reason, because he wants to raise the awareness and for us to support this campaign. And in the chat group of the Zoom meeting has been posted links to the This Is Ongoing War blog spot and to the charity website of Karen Malki of the Malki Foundation. So please see those links there in the column and in the chat column, and do follow them up and take this opportunity. Mr. Roth, thank you so much for sharing in such a powerful and heart-wrenching way your message. And we thank you for giving us this opportunity to come together on Yom Hazikaron and hear your story, hear about your wonderful and precious daughter, Malka Chana. And thank you also for allowing us to dedicate the candle lighting that we are now undertaking, Le'iloi Nishmata, along with all the other victims of terror and soldiers who fell in battle. The next part of the service will be led by Shmuel Ebert, who will light a candle, say a Kel Mali Rachamim on behalf of our community for the victims of terror and for Malka Chana Bas Aaron Mordechai, after which we'll lead a Perek of Tehillim and we will sing Achenu. So I'm going to spotlight Shmuel and hand over to
Thank you very much.
מלא רחמים שוכן במרומים אמצעי מנוחה נכונה לכנפי השכינה במעלות קדושים טהורים וגיבורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמת מלכה חנה בת אהרון מרדכי ולנשמת חללי פעולות האיבה ולנפגעי הטרור ולנשמת הקדושים שנלחמו בכל מערכות ישראל במחתרת ובצבא הגנה לישראל ושנפלו במלחמתם ומסרו נפשם על קדושת השם העם והארץ. ברור שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם. לכן בעל הרחמים יחתירם וסייסר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצחור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם בגן עדן תהיה מנוחתם וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם ותעמוד לכל ישראל זכותם ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימים ונאמר
Amen.
We're now going to say Parak of Tehillim, which is on the screen. She'amalot mimamakim gadich Adonai. Adonai shema koli tiyena nechagash v'od lekol atachanunai.
shema b'koli tiyena aznecha
Im abonot ishmoya Adonai mi amod.
Im avayis tishmaya Adonai mi amod.
Im chas licha leman tivarei. Kili Adonai kimeta nafshi ולדברו חרתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר.
נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר.
יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי אם אדוני החסד והרבה עמו פדות.
יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי אם אדוני החסד והרבה עמו פדות.
והוא יפתח ישראל
הוא יפתח ישראל מכל עוונותיו. Amen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shmuel, and thank you again, Mr. Roth. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining.